The voice of sharing Durian ASEAN.
Welcome back, this is Arlene and you're still with Durian ASEAN. And you're also with Marie-Chris de Guzman, the lead convener of the ASEAN Young Public Servant as well as the mover of the Youth DRR network. So from World Humanitarian Summit, we go down to a more niche area that a lot of people may not focus it, but is equally important in Southeast Asia. Now we are going to discuss further on the ASEAN youth involvement with the DRR.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
So first of all, I want to say, why DRR is very important in Southeast Asia?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a very interesting question because coming from the Philippines, I was actually desensitized to disasters. Like, it's raining, okay, there's typhoon, it's okay, flooding, it's okay. Like, I'm used to it. And I think it's weird and interesting because I only felt the gravity of the situation when I went to Indonesia for like a paper conference, and so it's about the environment. And they brought us to Padang, which is one of the areas in Indonesia which has a lot of disasters as well, tsunami, earthquake, and so they brought us to this area where I think hundreds of people died.
Oh wow!
So it was an eye opener for me. Like, oh my gosh, it's actually it's a development issue.
That's true.
So I think that exposure gave me a deeper understanding of how disasters affect the lives of the people.
That's true.
So for example, from the government perspective, why is it important? For one, it slows down your economy because it affects public assets. So for example, there's typhoon, there's earthquake. So these natural hazards result to the destruction of public assets, properties.
And not to mention human resources.
Yes, right. Lives of the people. So it's from a governance perspective, it's actually very, very important. You have to understand disasters in the context of national development. But let's say for the common family, like, how is disaster going to affect me? So for example, let's say there's a category called near poor. So someone is, not in the poverty line, but nearing the poverty line. And then that person or that family is affected by disasters. So probably they can lose their homes.
And usually it's just one person that would carry the income for the family.
Right. So let's say, because of earthquake or tsunami or landslide or whatever, they lose their house. So that family can be categorized again as a poor family. Yeah. So it really affects your economic situation as well.
That's true.
And of course, the most immediate is, you can die immediately from earthquakes.
And I think the experience that we see in Japan, where they they have such a superb way of disaster reduction that they managed to save many lives that could have perished, and they are able to relocate people as soon as possible post disaster. We saw how they mitigated people during the earthquake, during the floods and tsunami.
Right.
So these are areas that I think Southeast Asia should also be doing more. Are they doing more?
Yeah, I think I've noticed though that countries with more disasters are more active. But for some countries that are not really that affected by disasters, there are lesser movements, I think, on the ground, or lesser policies or governance structures as to DRR. So
that's a very interesting observation. I mean, take for example, Malaysia is a relatively safe country, but just last year we had one of the worst flood happening in the northern region of Peninsula Malaya, and even the government were caught off guard, partly because we never really had a long-term plan for DRR in this case. Yeah. So in the case of Southeast Asia, with the event that you were talking about, the Disaster Risk Reduction Network, how can it help Southeast Asia in this case?
Okay, so that's a good question because right now the ASEAN Youth DRR Network is just a Facebook group wherein we share information, we share trainings and conferences where the youth can actually participate in. But actually, after my trip here, I'm heading to Jakarta for a meeting with the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Office and other ASEAN institutions because we wanted to push for the formalization of the network. Now, why is this network important? Number one, it will be a network for young people, for young advocates and practitioners in the region to train fellow youth, to discuss issues on DRRM, to create movements on the ground, to come up with projects and programs for the youth, and to also help in the policy and agenda setting of the different countries or the different avenues on disaster governance in the region. So it's more of like giving youth representation, a voice for the youth, and also an avenue for the youth to actually, be more involved in the disaster risk governance.
So what's the difference, by the way? Disaster risk governance and disaster risk reduction. Perhaps you can just explain more because a lot of the listeners may not be aware of such term,
Okay. So when you say disaster risk governance, it's more of like the mechanism for a country, for example, on how they address disaster issues. So for example, in the Philippines, we have the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. And in the village level and in the municipal and city level, we also have disaster risk reduction offices.
Yeah. What do they do usually on the local level?
They come up with policies on DRR. They also do programs and projects related to DRR, so they involve different stakeholders in the community. And they're also in charge of purchasing equipment that are needed for DRR, disaster response particularly. So at least in the Philippines, for let's say the income of the municipality, at least 5% of that should go to the disaster risk reduction offices. And there's actually a good development right now because last year they've passed a legislation that the youth should have representation in the disaster risk reduction offices in the Philippines. So it's just a matter of implementing that policy. And it's good because at least, the youth are very vulnerable. But, I think more than being vulnerable, we have a lot of energy, enthusiasm, and knowledge, which we can actually contribute to, to help address disaster issues.
So these are permanent seats for the youth to become like the consultant to the government?
Yeah, just like the representative of their city or municipality. So what will happen is like the disaster risk reduction offices will nominate youth members, and then the chief executive officer, like the mayor, will pick one to sit in the disaster risk reduction, council and office.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a good way to really directly involve the youth, especially in policy making and agenda setting.
So tell us more about the network. When is it and how it's going to be done?
Okay, so right now the tentative timeline, because right now it's just an online platform. So we're going to Jakarta for the meeting this coming week to finally formalize it. And depending on the outcome, what we wanted to happen is to launch the network during the ASEAN Summit, hopefully, and other disaster risk reduction, conferences or summits in this coming in the coming months. So after that, one of the output that the network should have is the creation of a regional toolkit for young humanitarians. So at least this will inculcate culture of preparedness, especially in addressing disasters and other humanitarian issues, and it aims to build the capacities of young people. So it would contain basic humanitarian principles, where-tos, how-tos, before, during, before, during, after man-made disasters. And the good thing is that it's not just in English. We want to translate it into local languages so that everyone, as long as you can read, you can understand.
That's very good. Anyway, we'll take another short break. On the third segment of the discussion, we will discuss another issue that youth might be interested, which is on migration. Stay tuned.
You're now listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing.